Let's talk Golden Armor, Guardian Spears, Dreadnoughts and Grav Tanks, with a look at the Emperor's own Guardians and Adeptus Custodes in Warhammer 40k, and which units are looking strongest and weakest for the faction right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a rough tier list for the faction for power levels in 10th edition. In this one I thought we'd go through each and every Adeptus Custodes unit, both in their own index and their Forge World index, talk through where I'd rank them in terms of power right now, and why I'd rank them where I would. With that in mind, I've ranked the Adeptus Custodes units into 4 tiers for a rough appraisal of their current power, and this one, as with a few other similar tier lists on the channel, have been both a combination of your guys' votes in a channel poll, plus a fair few of my own opinions and what things crop up in competitive lists a bit more. Obviously tier lists are a bit on the arbitrary side, some things could be ranked a little bit higher or lower depending on the army and the context of where you're playing. And as always, if you feel like I've ranked anything too high or too low, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. In any case though, let's jump straight into it and talk Custodes in 10th. Starting out, first up we have the units that I consider some of the weakest in the army right now, and first up we have the Sisters of Silence Vigilators for 15 points per model, the girls with the Great Blades. You can either get them in units of 4, 5, or 9 or 10, and I feel like if there's ever a unit that feels a little bit redundant within the index itself, these girls will be fairly high on the list I think. Kind of similar combat ability to what say standard Custodian Guard get, but just massively more fragile. Theoretically could be at least fairly efficient against Psykers with the anti-Psyker keyword and devastating wounds, but in reality they're just a little bit too specialised to be taken as an all-comers option. If you want just small interference units, then the other Sisters of Silence do it better I think, or maybe the Adeptus RBT's Exaction squads, and I feel like Sisters of Silence in general maybe just got a little bit less relevant for the actual anti-Psyker abilities, given they no longer interfere with psychic buffing abilities anymore. Otherwise, I've also chosen to rank the Knight Centura down here at 75 points. Her combat abilities I don't think are particularly exciting, and the 2 buffs that she gives to her unit are some extra movement, advance and charge, and also desperate escape if enemies try and fall back from them. Both she and Alea are at least fairly helpful for putting in Vigilators units if you did want to build around them, not that I'm sure that's a good idea, but I'd say overall 75 points is just a bit expensive for those kind of special rules. Out of the two I'd probably prefer to have Alea, who at least fights really quite hard in combat with strength 6 and damage 3, and gives them the fights first ability as her buff. Next up are the Custodians with the Adressite or Pyrothite Spears, 325 points for a locked squad size of 5 of them. These guys just seem utterly overshadowed by the regular Custodian Guard squad, paying a massive plus 20 point tax per guy, which is enormous, and then arguably just getting a bit of a side grade really on the standard Custodian Guardian Spears, which already have kind of okay shooting. Instead of that, they either get a melter gun or an Adrathic weapon, just horribly overcosted compared with Custodian Guard and far less flexible. I think the unit could probably afford to drop like 50 points or so, and even then they'd probably be a bit of a niche pick. In a similar vein, I feel like the Aquilon Terminators again just compare absolutely horribly with the Alarus Terminators. They cost a decent amount more at 230 points or 460 for 6 of them. Basically a 12 point per model increase over the Alarus, and they just don't really gain all that much. They get a plus 1 strength on their weapons over the Guardian Spears. Strength 7 to strength 8 is helpful against a few, but not really against all that many things right now. I'd say despite these guys having some interesting shooting options, the Alarus combination of Guardian Spears and grenade launchers I think is usually going to be the same or better against the majority of targets. Plus on top of that, the Alarus special rule is just enormously massively better than these guys. 4 rerolls to wound against characters, monsters and vehicles covers a lot of the scariest things in the enemy army list, and it seems pretty painful to be paying more for these guys when you're losing a much better special rule. Finally, for rating some of the weaker units in the army, I've also chosen to rank the Ares and Orion gunships down here, either 580 points or 690 points worth of big golden flyer. Admittedly, at least they do have some fairly scary firepower, and then either the transport capacity or Infernus firebombs. Out of the two, I think that the Ares is solidly better, the firebombs maybe not so much, but at least it comes with a whole slew of genuinely quite dangerous anti-tank weapons with those Arachnus blaze cannons, so it should be a threat if the opponent's got some big units they don't want to lose. I think most lists will choose to pass them up though. They're just enormously big all-in investments that don't really help you much for objectives, and while the defense is okay, it's not that awesome for 600 points worth of models. Though I'd say out of the two, I'd probably be more tempted by the Ares, at least that can genuinely blast some enemy tanks off the table. Maybe I was a bit harsh on that one, it could have been a candidate for moving up to tier 3 perhaps. I'd still certainly rather have Caladius tanks for anti-tank shooting though I think. Moving on to tier 3 units, and first up we have the Virtus Praetors, 90 points each, and you can either have 2 or 3 of them, or 5 or 6 of them. I think I definitely could have chosen to rank these bottom tier, probably towards the lower end of tier 3 in my opinion. The Custodian bikes have definitely lost a whole load of ability going from 9th to 10th. Weaker firepower, defense that didn't really increase in line with the rest of the index. There's still some good stratagems that can't be used on them, and the fly keyword works kind of horribly for mounted units now. They can't just jump over terrain without any consequence. They do get some Lance Guardian Spear attacks when they charge in, so at least they get +1 to wound, so that is something, though their melee damage output isn't that great still. They're still paying a premium for the shooting and the speed. And their special rule I don't think really helps them out either. They've got the option to do a mortal wound flyby attack once per game, though it will come at the expense of them shooting or charging, and in general you're going to be giving up more damage than you're actually gaining from the mortal wound attack, which is pretty bad. Definitely pretty underwhelming, and no one's really using them competitively. I feel like perhaps one of the most interesting things about them could be the fairly crazy double move that they can do with their captain on the jet bike. You can have them move their full move distance at the end of the enemy turn and then move again in yours, so you could potentially have an enormously ridiculously long threat range and pretty much guarantee that they get the charge on someone. Still though, I think there's definitely stronger options out there in the Custodian infantry now. Otherwise, for the Agamatus Custodians, I'd rank them pretty much the same as the Virtus Praetors now. Probably a little bit worse overall, a tiny bit more expensive, and less flexible squad sizes. Though in general, model for model, they have very similar stats, and I think their choice of ranged weapons competes well enough. Probably the Twin Link Strength 9 Damage 2-1 seems overall the best to me. Overall, I think they're at least fairly well balanced with the Virtus Praetors right now, even if that's not particularly strong. Again, could certainly use a bit of a buff. Next up, the Palace Gravitak is 120 points for a cheap little Custodian skimmer with some anti-infantry shots. It gets 8 attacks at Strength 5, AP 1, Damage 1, Twin Linked and Devastating Wounds. It's the kind of profile that's going to be kind of okay against virtually anything, at least a reasonable chance to get a mortal wound or two, but I think it's never going to be particularly exciting against anything whatsoever with its 120 point price tag. Could be usable enough for a relatively expendable unit to push onto objectives or to get line of sight on things that you might not be able to see. Should be able to clear a few enemy infantry over the course of the game, though it just seems so much less efficient than things like the Caladius tank for the extra points cost, even if that does cost significantly more. If you're taking one of these, it's probably also worth considering Armiger Helverins as well. For the small points differential, I feel like you're generally going to be better off with them compared with the Palace. Next up, we've got the big golden transport that is the Coronis Grav Carrier. This one's 200 points, so a little bit cheaper than its equivalent Caladius battle tank, and it is fairly tough with a similar sort of durability to a Land Raider with 16 wounds and a 2+ save. And it is at least quite fast as well with a 12-inch movement, so it should be able to slingshot some Custodes up the board. It transports 6 guys, its firepower is fairly dedicated anti-infantry, and its special rule is one of the ones that allow you to reroll wound rolls with shooting if you both focus on the same targets, which isn't terrible, but maybe will be a bit better if there were a few more Custodian units that had better firepower. The Sagittarium I think are okay, but not standout. It is also competing against the Land Raider as well for delivering very long charges for Custodes. I think in general that's going to be more useful, even if it does cost a fair bit more. The Land Raider does also come with a whole load more threat as well in my opinion. A whole bunch of las cannons hitting on a 2+ is probably better than the Coronis' anti-infantry shooting. Next up, we've got the trio of Custodes Dreadnoughts, the Venerable Contemptor from the main index, and then the Contemptor Galatus and Achilles from the Forge World section. These guys I think were really quite usable in 9th edition, but just seem to be pointed a bit too much in 10th. The points costs have kept broadly similar, but they have lost a fair bit of threat for the individual Dreadnoughts. Going from moving 8 inches to 6 inches is really quite a big deal for vehicles that need to move around terrain. It means they really struggle to get into combat with their targets that they need to reliably, and they're far less tough than they used to be in the previous edition, losing their -1 damage rule and also their 6+ feel no pain, both of which sting quite a lot. I feel like the Dreadnoughts are all at least fairly usable. The regular Contemptor is 185 points and is mixed threat with either Melter or Assault Cannon, and does have that fun resurrection rule. Quite nice to have it pop up when it's gone down the first time. Though I'd say at that higher price tag, its damage and defense are just super underwhelming for the cost. The Contemptor Achilles I still think has generally the best overall threat. Mixed threat at range, plus some fairly solid anti-tank in melee. A whole bunch of attacks with its Strength 12 Guardian Spear with damage d6+1. Not too bad if it can make it into combat, it might just struggle to get there with the slower movement and less barriers to damage. Finally, the Contemptor Galatus at least does being fairly tough a fair bit better. It's got a 4+ invulnerable save and -1 to wound in melee, a flamer attack with a fist, and then a whole bunch of attacks with strength 8 and damage 3, so fairly efficient against elite infantry. I say all three of them are usable. I'll be a bit more tempted by both the Forge World variants over the regular Contemptor, but I think they're far from the strongest thing that the Custodians can field right now. Next up, we've got the Jetpack Custodians of the Venatari. I think most people found their points cost kind of disappointingly high in 10th edition. 235 points for 3 of them, or 470 for a squad of 6. Just enormously high investment for what they do and pay a massive premium for their mobility, and they don't even move all that fast in terms of just raw movement characteristic, just 10 inches now. Though they do deep strike at least and can rapid ingress for 0 CP, which I guess is handy enough as that's quite a powerful stratagem. For the loadouts, I'd be a lot more tempted to take their Lance Guardian Spears as opposed to the Tarsus Bucklers at the moment. At least they will hit fairly hard on the charge with a +1 to the wound roll and still get the standard Guardian Spear type shooting. And they also can fall back and shoot and charge, which is kind of handy as it means that the opponent can't lock them in combat. I think they do have some nice things going for them. Potentially rapid ingress is very nice with the +1 to wound charging. Could pretty much guarantee a charge towards the heart of your opponent's army, and that sounds very powerful. But I think in reality, versus the on-foot custodians, the point differential is just far too big. You could still just pay the 1 CP and rapid ingress either custodian guard or wardens and things, and you can still have things like Alaris teleporting around the table. Next up, and back to the Sisters of Silence, we've got the Witch Seekers. 15 points each for a basic sister with a flamer, either 4 to 5 of them or 9 to 10, so they can be really quite low investment units, and they are at least a bit more of a credible damage threat compared with the Prosecutors. For 15 points, I feel like they're just a little bit overcosted with where I'd really want them to be. If you just want a minimum investment infantry squad to camp objectives and do screening and things, then the Prosecutors do that for 20 points cheaper, which is pretty significant. And for the extra flamer attacks, their damage output still isn't really all that great. I feel like in general they're perhaps a 20 point maybe upgrade to Prosecutors if you already had a unit of them and then had 20 points that you weren't sure what to do with. It's quite nice that they can scout into the midfield, so they could hopefully take up some positions on a safe objective. And I guess with mass flamers they do have at least the potential to do a bit of overwatch damage against the right sort of light infantry targets. Though unless you can actually wipe out a squad or anything, I feel like in general you're going to be better off spending those CP elsewhere still. Next, for 75 points, there's the Psychana Rhino. I think there's nothing really too much wrong with the Psychana Rhino. It does pretty much the same as the other rhinos do for other factions, though I feel like with the Vigilators and the Witch Seekers priced the way they are, I think it's rarely going to be the choice that most people choose to take to deliver them. If you want to try and make either of those work in big numbers, then the Rhino is probably one of the better ways to do so, either a battlefield bunker to have the Vigilators charge out of, or it could move and then disembark the Witch Seekers to jump them onto an objective and unleash those flamers. There might be a bit of an element of throwing some more points after slightly weaker units though, whereas you might have just been better with some of the stronger custodians in the first place. Finally, for the tier 3 units, we've got Alea for 80 points, probably towards the bottom end of tier 3 in my opinion. It could have been a tier 4 unit. I feel like on balance she's probably a bit better support for a bigger Sister of Silence unit if you wanted to use one. Some genuinely fairly threatening melee with strength 6, AP 3 and damage 3 plus devastating wounds and anti-psyker. And then she also gives her unit fight first as well, so that could make something like a unit of Vigilators genuinely quite intimidating for the enemy to charge. Again, like the Knight Centura and the Psychana Rhino though, might just be a little bit questionable to throw even more points after one of these units rather than just using them as cheap little disruption and distraction units. Moving on, we get onto the tier 2 units. These are considered a bit more usable for the Adeptus Custodes overall. They're still probably a little bit behind the top tier stuff. There are just a few units that are very standout, and the vast majority of competitive lists tend to get built around. One that is maybe a little bit on the fence about, that could have been either tier 2 or lower tier 1, would be the Sisters of Silence Prosecutors. Their defense isn't awful with a 3+ save, though it's not particularly standout, and their damage output is really quite pitiful. But they're just really quite commonly taken in competitive Custodes army lists, just because they're literally units for 40 points. Really quite nice to have some expendable units for multiple reasons in the Custodes army, either screening out deep strikers to stop your important stuff getting hit, camping on either home field or midfield objectives for really cheap, or potentially being in the right places to do secondary objectives. You could strategic reserve them if you wanted to do that for the tactical secondaries. Their damage output really is quite mediocre, even against psychers where they get the devastating wounds and precision against. I feel like in general you just want to use them literally as bodies to take objectives, and perhaps one of the reasons that I might not consider them absolutely top tier 1 at the moment is competing with out of codex things like the Exaction Squad. Quite a lot of competitive lists seem to enjoy taking Exaction Squads in place of these Sisters units. Though I think if Games Workshop did increase the points a bit for those RBTs, these girls would probably be taken in their place. There's a lot of value in just having units, even if they don't really do that much, to screen and trade and hold objectives for cheap. You can potentially do a fun combo with them, with Inquisitor Greyfax in the unit with her Psychoculum. That can hopefully give you a fair amount of devastating wounds, mortal wounds against Psychers, though it is going to be something that's very good against Psychers but very bad against anything else. Next up, we've got the Sagittarium Custodians, 250 points for 5 of them. I think that these guys are okay, but not particularly standout. For 50 points for the model, you basically get a heavy bolter profile that you can fire on the move, plus a little bit of melee threat with a bunch of Misericordia attacks with Strength 5, AP 2, and Damage 1. Otherwise, they get a once per game attack where they get devastating wounds for their weapons for a turn, which I think perhaps sounds a little bit better than it is, though they do hand out a -1 to hit penalty on one unit each turn, and that could be kind of big against the right foe, I suppose. I feel like being unable to be taken in units any less than 5 is a bit of a disadvantage as well. I feel like for ranged custodians that can chip in with a bit of firepower, you might want them to be holding some slightly safer objectives. It's just a fair bit more than you'd really want. Next up, we've got the unique shield captain Valerian, 115 points, and does bring a few interesting things. He brings a whole bunch of strength 8, AP 3, and damage 2 attacks with his unique guardian spear, so he does hit significantly harder than a standard pattern shield captain. Plus, he's got his own feel no pain type save, and some personal rerolls and automatic 6s built in. Maybe just adding a fair bit less to his squad though, with only debuffing enemy melee by AP -1, as opposed to all the free stratagems or big advances and charges that you can do with other characters. I think it's really not too bad for a fighty squad of Custodian Guard or Wardens, but realistically I feel like competitive lists just really aren't going to pick him over things like Trajan Valoris, the regular shield captain, or the Blade champion. There's just 3 choices that are solidly better than him, and with how expensive Custodians captains are, he's probably not going to get picked in lieu of them. Next we've got the Venerable Land Raider for 260 points. Kind of similar to most other Land Raiders out there, except it hits on a 2+ with those las cannons, and that does add up to them being fairly accurate and fairly deadly anti-tank. I feel like there's enough value between its anti-tank shooting plus the very long charges it can deliver to justify one on the tabletop if you want to run one. Definitely could be a bit of a power play with Custodians charging the enemy around about 20 inches or more away. Perhaps likely a Custodian Guard squad with a character might be the best fit to go in it. Unfortunately, Wardens just don't work very well with it with their unit sizes. Nice to see it looking quite a lot more playable than it was before, perhaps. Again, though, it maybe just doesn't really seem all that necessary, perhaps, versus, say, Blade Champions advancing and charging foot Custodies, or just having a great big golden wall just march up onto the midfield objectives and take the objectives against all comers. I think it's definitely strong enough to be interesting, though, if you do want to build around one. Next, for 145 points, we've got the Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike. I'd argue that as points for the character go, he actually really isn't too bad. It's just maybe let down by Virtus Praetors and the Agamators Custodians at the moment, both being a bit overcosted for what they do compared with other options. He's 25 points more compared with his on-foot counterparts, and I feel like the stat line boosts that he gets for that are probably good enough to outweigh that. Extra movement, a decent enough gun, and lance on his combat attacks as well. Then he can give 0 CP stratagems out to the Virtus Praetors, though we'll admit a couple of the best ones are locked to the infantry units with the -1 damage and reviving Custodians. Still though very powerful when he can put stratagems for free on such a big powerful units like the jetbikes are. And he can help them out with a little bit of extra consolidation as well, which could be useful after a fight. I think perhaps one of the low-key things that he's actually genuinely quite good for is his once per game double movement. He gets to use this in the fight phase, and he could either use it to get out of an ongoing combat, or I think perhaps more powerfully just to use it when you're not in combat. Use it at the end of your opponent's fight phase, even if these guys weren't in melee. You can then get to move them 12 inches in the enemy turn, then move your normal 12-inch movement in your own turn, so potentially you could have a jetbike squad doing 24 inches worth of movement before going on to charge. In general, I think that should be enough movement to pretty much guarantee a charge on more or less what you want in the enemy army. Really quite a big move that, even if it does cost a whole load. In reality, his worth is still going to be tied to the Virtus Praetors and the Agamators Custodians. If they were stronger, then he'd be taken, no doubt. I guess that might be possible. They could wind up as one of the stronger units in the index again if Games Workshop do wind up shifting some points around. Finally, for the tier 2 things, we've got the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought, 235 points and really quite tough and chunky. Toughness 10, 12 wounds, a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable, and -1 damage. That's still really quite a nice little stack of stats there. He definitely feels a lot more tanky than he is dangerous, and perhaps a bit more so than 9th edition I'd say. I think if running one now, I'd still be tempted to take one arm with the Telemon Cestus, and then one with a ranged weapon of your choice. I'd still say perhaps not one of the most standout Custodes units, but could be pretty annoying for really quite a lot of anti-tank units to have to chew through, particularly if you can put it somewhere where it's going to be threatening enough to actually make the opponent have to worry about it. At least this guy has an 8-inch move as well, unlike the Contemptors these days. Finally though, and getting on to tier 1, here are the units that I'd currently rate strongest in the index for Adeptus Custodes, and the vast majority of top performing tournament lists do seem to be building around this list of units. First up, and perhaps taking pride of place amongst any of these, are the Custodian Guard. The standard Custodes battle line with Guardian Spears remains pretty indomitable, just 45 points each essentially, and then squads of either 4 or 5 or 9 or 10. I think they're pretty viable both in the smaller and the bigger size units. In both cases, really quite chunky and a good choice for characters and stratagems. For 45 points, they're really quite tough. Toughness 6, a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable and 3 wounds. And you can potentially mix in a few shield bearing custodians in the unit. They won't hit quite as hard in melee, but getting 4 wounds on a couple of them can be pretty handy for soaking up some damage 3 hits. In melee, they're really quite savage with their Guardian Spear damage output. Each of them gets 5 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2. Really nicely general purpose and massively good at killing Space Marines, and it's definitely a good profile that can make good use of the different martial guitar stances, particularly lethal hits if they happen to be punching up against something tough. Their shooting's useful enough to have as well, getting Assault 2 shots with Strength 4, AP 1 and Damage 1 out of those Guardian Spears, not having to choose between either advancing towards the foe and giving up firepower. They get to shoot twice once per game as well, which could be quite nice for a flurry of shots to really try and clear out a horde when you need to. If they're holding down an objective, which they've got a good chance to be doing, if they're moving up to the midfield and fighting over one, they get to reroll all wound rolls against their target, which is kind of massive. That really is going to be a huge damage output boost against just about anything, whether you're firing with the Guardian Spears or attacking in combat with their melee. The Vexilla is well worth having in the unit, I think, to get the extra objective control for 3 points on each guy. Definitely going to be meaningful if the squad starts getting depleted. And then with all these good rules going on just with the squad itself, they're pretty much the ideal unit to support with both stratagems and the leader choices that they have. Stratagems with reviving custodians, getting -1 damage, and potentially fighting first if they're on an objective maybe, and then just about any of the 3 major leader choices I think are absolutely fine for them. The Blade Champion, Trajan Valoris, or the regular Shield Captain I think are all great. Overall a really solid battle line unit to have in the army, not too surprised to see that lots and lots of people are running squads of these, both big ones and small ones. As an alternative choice to the Custodian Guard, there's also the Custodian Wardens, 3 or 6 models in the squad for either 150 or 300 points, so a little bit more expensive than the Custodian Guard. Their stat lines and profiles are pretty similar, and I would also arm them with Guardian Spears as opposed to the Axes. The damage 3 is just outweighed by the other disadvantages, I think. They trade out the more aggressive special rules for some more defensive ones. They get -1 to wound if a character is in a unit, so you basically always want to have a character there for them. For that reason, I think I'd usually want to run them in squads of 6 as opposed to squads of 3. And then just for one key turn, they can go on massive defensive mode and get a 4+ feel no pain. That's just pretty massive to either soak up one phase of big enemy shooting damage or big enemy combat, and you can often tell if your opponent's just moving a bunch of units in to try and deal critical damage to them and get them whittled down to a more manageable number. Overall, I feel like they're a very solid alternative, a very intimidating anvil unit that hopefully you might be able to encourage to get your opponent to shoot, rather than the other units in the army. Finally, for perhaps the 3 best flavours of custodians on foot, we have the Alarus Custodian Terminators, 65 points each and available either in squads of 2 or 3 or 5 or 6. Generally I'd see these as custodians skewed a bit more towards damage dealing than defensiveness, though obviously they're still very indomitable against any sort of small arms with 4 wounds and a big toughness 7, but I think compared with standard Custodian Guard, things like anti-tank weapons are just going to kill them a bit more efficiently, at least point per point. They've got fairly strong anti-infantry firepower between their Guardian Spears and their grenade launchers, which I think are quite nice and general purpose. They've got a fun redeployment rule where they can potentially teleport across the battlefield to even threaten a turn 1 charge if the stars align, but I think my favourite ability about them is that they get to re-roll the wound rolls against monsters, vehicles or characters, and that boost in particular just makes them enormously efficient against the absolute scariest stuff that your opponent's going to have in the army. I feel like at least the majority of major threats in the enemy army are probably going to fall into one of those categories, and in general they're going to be quite efficient against lighter infantry with their strength 7 attacks. Again, can be very solidly built around as well. They're super valuable for the Revive a Custodian stratagem to get 65 points and models back, and alternatively you can just field them in little 2 model units for 130 points. Kind of handy to be able to access smaller squads of Custodes if you don't need an entire squad to say fight for one objective, or do annoying deep strike type things to try and get secondary objectives. In general, I think in a Custodes army, I'd be more tempted to take limited numbers of these, in addition to a main battle line of Custodian Guard or Wardens, but I still think that they're very, very good for the cost. Next up, we've got the shield captains, perhaps in particular just the standard shield captain on foot, though if you're building around the Terminators, the Terminator captain seems absolutely fine as well. Both of those are 120 points, add a little bit of melee might to their units, but more importantly give them free stratagems, which are going to be a massive deal when they're usually going to be used on something like 300 plus points of models in the squad. In particular, making that -1 damage one free is really nice, as that one's usually 2 CP. That can make them massively tougher against things like damage 3 fire. Otherwise, reviving custodians, fighting first, or just about anything else that could be situationally useful is really quite good as well. I think they're probably worth it just for that alone, never mind their actual combat stats. In addition, the regular one can manipulate the martial guitars for the entire unit to get them 2 at the same time, and all 3 once per game, whereas the Alaris one gets to fight in death and has a beefier stat line as well. I'd say that's probably less useful overall, as you only really get the value out of that one if the entire squad is wiped, which I guess you'd hope it wouldn't normally be. I think as a first choice I'd be a bit more tempted by the standard one in squads of either Custodian Guard or Custodian Wardens, but I think they're both pretty fine in their own units. Trajan Valoris remains pretty immense for 145 points, very nice melee with his Watcher's Axe, a whole bunch of strength 10 and damage 3 attacks there, and then he can back that up further with the Moment Shackle, either getting fights first if that's going to be relevant, or doubling his attacks, or even giving himself a 2+ invulnerable save for a turn. Though I'd say that probably one of the first two is usually going to be a bit more reliably good. For the most part, he's just adding some raw might to his unit. He does allow them to ignore modifiers as well, which could be pretty helpful. He also comes with a Feel No Pain type save to make himself personally a lot tankier, plus some damage 3 shooting as well to chip in at range as the squad advances up the board. Still immensely scary as a threat to have lurking in the rank of one of these big units. Finally, for the good leader characters, there's the Blade Champion, the cheapest of the bunch at 100 points, and again he both adds some raw muscle to the unit, plus gives them a better delivery chance perhaps. He allows the squads to re-roll advances and charges to move them up the board faster, and gives you a once per turn advance and charge for the squad as well. Usually that's going to average around about a 19-inch charge threat range when you take account for his own rerolls. When he gets into combat, he's got the choice between 3 different stances that could be best against 1 wound, 2 wound, or 3 wound and more infantry. I do quite like the damage 3 one with the devastating wounds. That could be very nice if you're trying to punch up against tough tanks and vehicles and look out with a 6 or 2. Overall, really not too bad for 100 points. Can still be given things like enhancements and upgrades, and you can allow the squads to freely heroic intervene if that helps at all, though I feel like that's going to be kind of niche and situational. I think it's really quite a good delivery option to have a squad just move up the board somewhere safe behind some ruins, and then just charge out an enormously surprisingly long distance, and more something that the enemy wanted to keep safe themselves. Finally, last but not least, we have the Caladius Grav Tank, 215 points, and really quite big hitting and effective anti-tank firepower, with 4 shots hitting at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6 plus 2, and twin linked as well to re-roll the wound rolls, giving you really quite a good chance of at least some saves being failed, and some enormous damage results going through onto the enemy vehicle. Otherwise, it's got a little bit of anti-infantry shooting, plus lethal hits if it targets vehicles and monsters with that big main cannon. Plus it's pretty tough at toughness 11, a 2+ save with a 5+ invulnerable and 14 wounds. Particularly with its big profile, you should usually be able to get cover for it, so it should be quite a durable tank. 4 options for Custodes fire support if you want some at the moment. This does seem to be the go-to. Doesn't seem to be enormously well balanced compared with the Dreadnoughts or anything else in the army list. It's both fairly fast, fairly tough, and absolutely devastating to enemy armour. So anyway, with the tier 1 units done, that brings us to the end of our strongest units in Adeptus Custodes tier list. Let me know what you've been running to success currently in Warhammer 40k right now, and which units you'd rate as strongest and weakest for the Custodes at the moment. Fully happy to hear if you think I should have ranked any of the units a little bit higher or a bit lower. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.